talk to you a bit about the argument, the cultural differences argument that is in Chapter 2, and talk about why the argument is invalid. And in Chapter 2, I address some logical considerations. We talk about logic a bit, and we talk about the terms of evaluation that logicians use, like valid or invalid, and that can be quite confusing. And there's really one point I want you to get out of this portion of Chapter 2 where I'm talking about the cultural differences argument, the argument which says different cultures have different moral beliefs, therefore there are no objective moral facts. And what I want you to get from that discussion is that the argument is a bad one. The argument is absolutely awful, although we find the argument used quite a lot. That doesn't mean cultural relativism is mistaken. All that follows is that if you're going to argue for cultural relativism, you should never, ever use the cultural differences argument to support the view. And to understand why the argument is bad, we need to at least get some introduction to logic, because all good reasoning must be logical. You can't reason well unless you're reasoning logically. And in our society, unfortunately, we don't tend to reason logically. There are a number of reasons for this. One reason is that we're not taught logic in our youth, and that's perhaps disquieting, because if there's one thing that we do more than any other, is reason. We reason more than we communicate, because even when we communicate with others, we're still using reason. But as studies have shown and philosophers have known for some time, people don't tend to reason very well. So we're going to learn some terms of evaluation and how to evaluate arguments from the logical point of view. And you'll find that later when we talk about abortion, capital punishment, or gun control, and I give certain arguments for both sides from different philosophers, those arguments will be good ones in the sense that they're logical. They're completely logical. So what do you do from the logical point of view? How do you evaluate an argument? Well, there are two ways you can evaluate an argument. You can evaluate whether the reasons given support the claim, in other words, the structure of the argument, or you can evaluate whether the reasons are true. So suppose I say, today is Thursday, therefore God exists. Now, you know that's a bad argument. And you know that it's a bad argument without even knowing what day of the week it is. You don't need to. Suppose that you have no idea what day of the week it is, and I give you that argument. You can say that's a bad argument, and it wouldn't make sense for me to say, how would you know? You don't even know what day of the week it is. The reason you know it's a bad argument is because the reason I've given doesn't support the conclusion. And logic is about this relation of support. Can the reasons imply the conclusion? Do they imply the conclusion? Do they support to a sufficient degree the conclusion? It's about the architecture of reasoning. And in order to reason well, you've got to get the architecture right first and foremost, because if you don't have reasons that support the conclusion, it doesn't matter whether your reasons are true. It just doesn't matter, because they can't get you to the conclusion. So when we say an argument is valid, what we're saying is that the reasons given imply the conclusion. They entail the conclusion. If the reasons are true, the conclusion has got to be true. And that's why when we assess arguments for validity, we begin by assuming the reasons are true and ask ourselves, assuming the reasons are true, would the conclusion have to be true? So take that one argument I give in the text. Chicago is the capital of the U.S. The capital of the U.S. is in Illinois. Therefore, Chicago is in Illinois. Now, let's suppose that Chicago is the capital of the U.S., and let's suppose that Chicago is in Illinois. It would have to follow that the capital of the U.S. is in Illinois. That would have to follow. If the premises or the reasons are true, the conclusion would have to be true. So we see in that argument, even though one of the reasons is false, Chicago is the capital of the U.S., still there's this nice relation of support between the reasons given and the conclusion. If the reasons are true, the conclusion's got to be true. And so when we assess arguments from the logical point of view, we're looking at that relation of support. We're looking to see if the reasons adequately support the conclusion. And when they don't, we call the argument invalid. Now, I'm not going to test your ability to know the ins and outs of logic on the exam, so don't worry too much if you're having a little difficulty understanding how to assess validity or invalidity. What I want you to know from this chapter is that the cultural differences argument is invalid. The structure of the argument is just awful. It's terrible. It's invalid to argue in this way. Different cultures have different moral beliefs or different moral codes. therefore there are no objective moral facts. That argument is horrible. Now, there are only a handful of philosophers who are cultural relativists, but none of them would ever be caught dead using that argument because it's invalid. This isn't just a matter of opinion. All logicians would agree the argument is a bad one. So, let's talk a bit about objectivism real quick, because the cultural relativist here is trying to argue against objectivism, and that's how they're trying to support their view. They're saying, objectivism is mistaken, so cultural relativism must be correct. Well, objectivism is the idea, once again, that what makes an act right has nothing to do with how you or I think or feel about the act. It has nothing to do with what the culture thinks or feels about the act. Acts are right or wrong regardless of how we think about those actions. So rape would be wrong, not because the majority of our culture disapproves of it, but for some objective reason, some reason about what rape involves. Because if cultural relativism is true, then it can be the case that rape is right, as long as the majority approves of it. And the objectivist says, no, that's mistaken. Surely rape can't be right. Rape has got to be wrong. You might say the objectivist, but not everyone believes that rape is wrong. But that's uninteresting. Because remember, we're not talking about what people believe. We're talking about what makes an act right. We're talking about rightness itself. The chemist doesn't go around trying to figure out what water is by asking people what they believe about water. They examine water itself. And so if objectivism is true, it can be the case that all sorts of people think that rape is right, but that wouldn't make it right, supposing objectivism is true. There was a case some time ago in the United States where a girl fled an African country because they practiced female circumcision there. And the question was, well, should we send her back or should we give her asylum? And if objectivism is true, it's not that the majority makes it right in the culture she was in, but it's wrong relative to our culture. It could be that it's just wrong, period. And even if the majority in her culture approved of female circumcision, it would still be wrong. So that's the objectivist view. And one type of objectivism is utilitarianism. And the utilitarian says an act is right when it produces the best consequences. So you'll notice that according to the utilitarian, when assessing an act for its moral status, we look to the consequences of that act. We don't look inward. We don't look to the culture. We look past the act to the consequences. And those consequences are out there. They're objective. They're what make an act right or wrong. So that's a type of objectivist view, because you or I or the culture does not construct what's right or wrong. The consequences determine whether an act is right or wrong. And the cultural relativist thinks that's crazy. That's absurd. There can't be objective moral facts. And so one way they try to argue against that is to say, look, you got all these cultures and they have different moral beliefs. Some cultures practice infanticide. Some cultures practice female circumcision. There are a few cultures who still practice sacrificing infants to appease the gods, and some other things out there that we would normally disagree with. And the cultural relativist says, surely given all this cultural disagreement, there can't be objective moral facts. So that's the argument. Different cultures have different moral codes, therefore there are no objective moral facts. Now this argument was popularized probably in the early 1900s by anthropologists, and you see it everywhere. People use it all the time. But the argument is a bad one. Here's why. Let's look at the structure of the argument, because having a good argument, using a good argument, is a matter first and foremost of having the right structure. And if your structure is bad, then it doesn't matter what you put in there. The argument's going to be a bad one. So the structure of the argument is this. It moves from noticing that people disagree about something to the claim there is no objective fact of the matter. People disagree about something, therefore there is no objective fact of the matter. Is that sort of reasoning valid? No. Let's apply it to science. There are cultures who have very strange scientific beliefs. They do. People disagree about science. But we don't go on to infer that there are no objective scientific facts. We think there are objective scientific laws. They exist. We didn't make them up. We discover them. So if there is a culture that denies the existence of gravity, surely when you go over to that culture, you won't start floating. No, the laws of gravity will still apply, because we don't make up the laws of science. They're objective. They're out there to be discovered. So just because people disagree about science, it doesn't follow that there are no objective scientific facts. There still could be. In fact, we think there are. And in theoretical sciences, there is a lot of disagreement. Quite a bit. But no one says, well, since there's so much disagreement in the theoretical sciences, it must be the case that everyone's right. It's just relative to culture. We think there's still a fact of the matter, an objective fact. We just don't know what it is in some cases. So notice, no one's willing to make that move when it comes to science. Take religion. Different cultures have different religious beliefs. Therefore, there is no objective fact of the matter whether God exists. That's the same argument. It has the same structure. That argument is clearly invalid. Either God exists or he doesn't. He can't both exist and not exist at the same time. You can't make God exist by believing that God exists. So, just because people have different religious beliefs, it doesn't follow that there is no objective fact of the matter whether God exists. It doesn't follow that somehow God's existence is relative to cultures, because God can't both exist and not exist at the same time. He does either one or the other. So even though we have all these religions disagreeing, and you might say, well, who's to say who's right? It still follows that at least one of them is right. The atheists and the theists can't both be right. They can't both be right. The atheist who believes that there is no such thing as God, and the theist who believes God exists, they can't both be right. It's either one or the other. So there's still an objective fact of the matter. We just may not know what it is. Think about historical beliefs. Historians have huge debates about what happened in the past, and different cultures have different beliefs about their history. So Native Americans have quite a different belief about how their ancestors, about how their ancestors arrived in North America, beliefs that differ from the scientists and the historians. But they can't both be right. They can't both be right. There certainly is a fact of the matter how their ancestors arrived in North America. There's an historical fact of the matter. So just because people disagree, it doesn't follow that it's all relative. They're right, and the historian and the scientist are right as well, because they're both saying inconsistent things. What they're saying can't both be true. And so there's still an objective fact of the matter. We may not know what it is, but there's still an objective fact of the matter, just like there's an objective fact of the matter of whether it rained on this very spot 200 years ago. We'll never know what it is, but either it did or it didn't. So just because people disagree, you're not then licensed to infer there is no objective fact of the matter. But the same applies to morality. Just because people disagree about what's right or wrong, it doesn't follow that there is no objective fact of the matter. There still could be an objective fact of the matter. Now, let's get clear about what I'm arguing here. I'm not arguing that cultural relativism is false. All I'm arguing is that this argument for cultural relativism is a bad one. Nor am I arguing for objectivism. All I'm saying is this: even if cultures disagree, objectivism can still be true. The disagreement of cultures has no bearing on whether objectivism is true or false, just as the disagreement in cultures with regard to science has no bearing on whether objectivism in science is true or false. So notice that we don't feel comfortable saying, well, different cultures have different scientific beliefs, thus there are no objective scientific facts. No one feels comfortable saying that. But when it comes to morality, we think, oh, this is a good inference. Different cultures have different moral beliefs, therefore there are no objective moral facts. But the inference is bad across the board, because of the structure. The inference is what we call invalid. Now, on the test, you'll see me use that inference several different times. And every time you see it, you should notice that it's a bad inference. Right? It's a bad one. Sometimes I'll be asking a question about something, and as one of the multiple choice answers, I'll give that inference. And in the answer, it'll say it's a good inference. You know that answer is not a good one. It's wrong, because that inference is a bad one. That argument is a bad one. And it's hard for us to get accustomed to the idea that form of reasoning is bad, because it's instinctual. I don't know how it becomes instinctual, but it does. For many of us, it just seems right to infer from the fact that different cultures have different beliefs to the conclusion that objectivism has got to be wrong. And it's not a good inference. So you have to fight that instinct. Okay? Fight that instinct, and if you can, then you'll do a lot better on the test. La, la, la.